A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
So, I was looking at the price of fuel for a 70-foot yacht the other day, and let me tell you, my dreams of a sovereign Poppleberry Navy took a bit of a financial hit. I was thinking, if we just get far enough away from the shore, we can stop paying taxes, stop following building codes, and maybe finally launch that experimental bioluminescent algae farm I've been dreaming about. But today's prompt from Daniel is actually keeping that dream alive, or at least giving us the legal reality check we desperately need before we sink our life savings into a floating fortress. He wants us to look into the high seas as a final frontier for escaping government reach. Is it truly the Wild West? Or is it just a very wet version of a gated community with even stricter rules?
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, I have been waiting for this. After our little adventure with land-based micronations back in episode 1153, where we learned that every square inch of dry dirt is already claimed by someone with a bigger army than us, I realized our biggest mistake was having solid ground under our feet. Dirt belongs to someone. The ocean, however, is theoretically the Great Common. It covers over 70% of the planet, and for centuries it was the place you went to disappear. But the legal reality in 2026 is far more complex than the pirate movies suggest. We are not just talking about avoiding the Coast Guard. We are talking about a massive, interlocking web of international treaties that have been drying out the lawless part of the ocean for decades.
People always talk about international waters as this lawless void where you can do whatever you want. It is the ultimate trope in every thriller movie. The villain escapes to the high seas because the police have to stop at some invisible line in the water and just shake their fists at the horizon. Is that actually how it works, or are we just watching too much television? I want to know if I can actually build a casino on a barge and tell the IRS to kick rocks.
It is almost entirely a myth, Corn, and a dangerous one if you are actually planning to launch a boat. The idea of the high seas being a lawless zone is a fundamental misunderstanding of how maritime jurisdiction functions. In reality, the ocean is one of the most regulated spaces on the planet. It just uses a different set of rules than what we are used to on land. Think of it less like a void and more like a different operating system. On land, you are running Windows. On the ocean, you are running Linux. It is still an operating system with strict protocols, but the permissions are handled differently.
So there is no point where the laws of physics are the only thing I have to worry about? No point where I can just be Corn Poppleberry, sovereign of the surf?
Not unless you are on a different planet, and even then, I am sure there is a space treaty waiting for you. The framework most of the world uses is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. It was finalized in 1982 after decades of bickering, and it basically carved the ocean into specific zones. You do not just go from a country to nothingness. There is a gradual handoff of authority as you move away from the coast. It is like a series of concentric circles of power.
Okay, walk me through the handoff. If we are pulling out of the harbor on the Poppleberry flagship, which is currently a refurbished pontoon boat in my imagination, what is the first line we cross?
The first 12 nautical miles from the baseline, which is usually the low water mark of the coast, is called the Territorial Sea. Within those 12 miles, the coastal state has full sovereignty. Their laws apply exactly as they do on land. If you commit a crime there, you are in their jurisdiction, period. If you have a permit for a hot dog stand in New York City, you need a permit for that same stand 12 miles out. The only special rule is something called innocent passage, which allows foreign ships to pass through as long as they are not being a threat. You cannot stop to fish, you cannot launch a drone, and you certainly cannot start your sovereign revolution there.
So we are still effectively in the country for the first 12 miles. That is barely enough time to get my sea legs. What happens when we hit mile 13?
From 12 to 24 nautical miles, you are in the contiguous zone. This is a bit of a buffer. The coastal state does not have full sovereignty here, but they can still enforce laws related to 4 specific areas: customs, fiscal issues, immigration, and sanitary regulations. This was designed to prevent smuggling. If you are sitting at mile 15 and trying to beam unauthorized signals or offload crates of untaxed maple syrup, they can still come after you. They have the right of hot pursuit, which means if they start chasing you in the contiguous zone, they can follow you all the way into the high seas to finish the arrest.
That seems like a pretty long leash. But then there is the big one everyone talks about, the Exclusive Economic Zone, or the EEZ. That goes out to 200 miles, right? That is where the big fishing boats and the oil rigs live.
200 nautical miles is the standard. In the EEZ, the coastal state has the exclusive right to all the resources. That means the fish, the oil, the gas, and even the energy from the waves or wind. However, they do not have general legal jurisdiction over people or ships just passing through. This is where the confusion starts. If you are on a boat 200 miles off the coast of Florida, the United States generally cannot arrest you for, say, not wearing a seatbelt on your boat, but they can definitely arrest you if you start drilling for oil or casting a massive net without a permit. You have freedom of navigation, but you do not have freedom of extraction.
So the high seas officially begin after that 200-mile mark? That is where we finally get to the anything goes part?
That is the start of the high seas, yes. But here is the catch that ruins the lawless dream. Every ship on the high seas must be registered to a country which we call the flag state. Under Article 92 of UNCLOS, a ship is subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of its flag state while on the high seas. If the Poppleberry yacht is flying a United States flag, United States federal law follows us all the way across the Atlantic. It is essentially a floating piece of American territory for legal purposes. If you commit a crime on that boat, you're going to a federal court in the U.S., not a pirate tribunal.
Wait, so if I fly the flag of a country that has very relaxed laws, I am essentially living under those laws? Is that why every cruise ship I have ever seen is registered in Panama or the Bahamas? It is not because the captains just really love the tropical weather.
You have discovered the flags of convenience. Companies register their ships in places like Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands because those nations have lower taxes, cheaper registration fees, and often more relaxed labor laws. It is a massive business. Panama has the largest shipping fleet in the world despite being a relatively small country, but it is not a total get-out-of-jail-free card. You are still under the jurisdiction of that country. If you commit a murder on a Panamanian ship, you are answering to Panamanian law. And international law requires a genuine link between the ship and the flag state, though in practice, that link is often just a stack of paperwork and a registration fee.
What if I just do not fly a flag? What if I'm a rebel and I decide to be a stateless vessel? Surely then I am finally free of the paperwork and the genuine links.
That is the worst mistake you could make, Corn. A stateless vessel is an international pariah. Under international law, specifically Article 110 of UNCLOS, any warship of any nation has the right of visit to board a ship that is reasonably suspected of being without nationality. If you fly no flag, or if you fly multiple flags to try and confuse people, any navy that sees you can board you, search you, and seize your vessel. You have no diplomatic protection and no legal standing. You are not a citizen of the sea, you are basically a target. It is the maritime equivalent of walking around with a sign that says, "Please search my pockets."
So you are either a piece of a country or a target for every navy in the world. That really puts a damper on the whole pirate aesthetic. I was hoping for more. Yo-ho-ho, and less. Let me check my maritime compliance manual. But there are still some things that apply to everyone, regardless of the flag, right? Universal crimes?
Piracy is the big one. It is the classic example of universal jurisdiction. Because pirates are considered hostis humani generis, or the enemy of all mankind, any nation can capture a pirate ship on the high seas and prosecute the pirates in their own courts, regardless of where the pirates are from or what flag they are flying. The same applies to the slave trade and, interestingly, unauthorized broadcasting from the high seas.
Unauthorized broadcasting? You mean like pirate radio? I thought that was the whole point of being in international waters. You get on a boat, you play the rock and roll that the government hates, and you become a legend.
It was a huge thing in the 1960s and 70s, especially around the United Kingdom with stations like Radio Caroline. They would sit on ships like the Mi Amigo just outside territorial waters and broadcast pop music that the BBC would not play. It was a massive cultural movement. But eventually, the international community got tired of it and updated the laws. Now, under Article 109 of UNCLOS, any nation where the broadcasts can be received, or any nation whose radio communication is being interfered with, can board the ship and shut it down. The loophole was closed with a very heavy door.
It feels like the world has spent the last century closing every possible loophole. But let's get into the practical side for our yacht expedition. Daniel asked about things like floating casinos. You see those in movies all the time. Is that actually a viable business model for us, or is that also a myth?
It is viable, but it is not because it is lawless. It is because of how gambling laws are written. Most countries only have the power to regulate gambling within their own borders. Once a ship reaches that 12-mile territorial limit, the state laws usually stop applying. The ship then operates under the laws of its flag state. If the flag state allows gambling, you can open the casino once you hit mile 13. That is why those cruises to nowhere exist. They just do loops in the ocean all night so people can play slots without the state of Florida taking a cut. But you still have to follow the safety regulations of your flag state, and you still have to pay your staff according to those laws.
So we just need to register the Poppleberry yacht in a country that loves poker, and we are in business. But what about the more ambitious stuff? Daniel mentioned seasteading. This idea of building permanent floating cities in the middle of the ocean. Why hasn't that taken off yet? It seems like billionaires are always talking about it.
Seasteading is a fascinating technical and legal challenge. The problem is that once you stop moving and start building a permanent structure, the legal definition of what you are changes. If you build a platform that is attached to the seabed, even in international waters, it is often treated as an artificial island. Under UNCLOS, Article 60, artificial islands do not have the status of islands. They do not have their own territorial sea or EEZ. Furthermore, if you are on the continental shelf of a country, even if you are outside their 12-mile limit, that country has the exclusive right to authorize and regulate the construction of such structures.
So if we try to build Poppleberry Island 205 miles off the coast, we are in the high seas. We are not on anyone's continental shelf. What happens then? Who is the boss of a floating bucket in the middle of the Pacific?
You still have the issue of sovereignty. To be a nation-state under the Montevideo Convention of 1933, you need 4 things: a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the ability to enter into relations with other states. The international community is very hesitant to recognize a floating platform as defined territory. If they did, every billionaire would build a platform to avoid taxes, and the entire global financial system would collapse. There is also the issue of the area. UNCLOS defines the seabed beyond national jurisdiction as the common heritage of mankind. It is managed by the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica. You cannot just claim the bottom of the ocean as your own personal basement.
We should probably talk about the most famous example of this, which is Sealand. I remember reading about that guy who took over an old anti-aircraft platform in the North Sea. He had a crown and everything.
Paddy Roy Bates. That is the gold standard for maritime micronations. In 1967, he occupied Ruff's Tower, which was a decommissioned British sea fort. It was located about 7 miles off the coast, which at the time was outside the 3-mile territorial limit the United Kingdom claimed back then. He declared it the Principality of Sealand, complete with a flag, a national anthem, and even its own currency.
And he actually won a court case about it, didn't he? That is the part that always gives people hope.
He did, but it is often misinterpreted. In 1968, a British court ruled that because the tower was outside British territorial waters at the time, the court had no jurisdiction over an incident involving firearms on the platform. That was a huge win for him, but it did not mean Sealand was a recognized country. It just meant the British courts could not stop him from being there at that moment. Later, in 1987, the United Kingdom extended its territorial waters to 12 miles, which now encompasses Sealand. They basically just ignore him now because it is more trouble than it is worth to evict a family from a rusty platform, but they certainly do not recognize his passports or his coins as anything other than souvenirs. If Sealand tried to start a war or launch a satellite, the UK would shut them down in an afternoon.
It seems like the common theme here is that you can exist in a legal grey area, as long as you are not bothering anyone important. But the moment you start doing something like questionable scientific experiments, which Daniel also mentioned, the grey area disappears. What if we wanted to do some high seas genetic splicing?
If we start doing genetic engineering on the yacht, we are still doing it on a vessel registered to a country. If we are on a Liberian ship, we are bound by whatever treaties Liberia has signed regarding biosafety and ethics. If we try to be a stateless ship to avoid those rules, we go back to being a target for any navy that wants to board us. And since 2023, we have the High Seas Treaty, also known as the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. It is aimed at creating protected areas in the high seas and regulating how we use the genetic resources of the deep ocean. By now, in 26, the enforcement mechanisms for that treaty are starting to get real teeth.
What about the cost of enforcement, though? If we are in the middle of the South Pacific, thousands of miles from anywhere, who's actually going to come and check our paperwork? Is there a sea police with a very long commute?
That is where the reality of the ocean hits. The ocean is vast, and patrolling it is incredibly expensive. Most of the high seas are effectively unmonitored. This is why things like illegal fishing and human rights abuses on fishing vessels are such a massive problem. It is not that it is legal, it is just that nobody is there to stop it. But for a high-profile project like a seastead or a floating casino, you are not invisible. You are a stationary target that people can see on satellite imagery. You cannot hide a city in the middle of the ocean anymore. Between SAR satellites and AI-driven vessel tracking, the void is actually quite crowded with data.
So the lawlessness of the ocean is more about the lack of police presence than the lack of actual laws. It is like speeding on a desert highway where you know there are no cops for 100 miles. It is still illegal, you just might not get caught until you crash.
That is a good analogy, but with one major difference, the insurance companies. This is something people always forget when they talk about seasteading. If you want to run a business or even just keep a yacht, you need insurance. No reputable insurance company is going to cover a vessel or a platform that is not properly registered and compliant with international maritime safety standards like SOLAS, which is the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. If you are not insured, you cannot dock in most ports. You cannot get financing. You are effectively cut off from the global economy. You become a ghost ship, unable to buy fuel or food legally.
That is the real kicker. You can escape the government, but you cannot escape the accountants. If you want to be part of civilization, you have to follow the rules of civilization, even if you are floating in the middle of the Pacific. It turns out the freedom of the high seas is mostly just the freedom to be very lonely and very uninsured.
It is the ultimate irony of the libertarian sea dream. To be safe and functional at sea, you need a massive amount of infrastructure and cooperation, which are the very things that lead to the creation of states and laws. The sea is a hostile environment. If your boat starts sinking, you want a Coast Guard to come save you. But if you want the Coast Guard to save you, you have to be part of the system that pays for the Coast Guard. You cannot be a sovereign nation on Monday and a distressed vessel calling for help on Tuesday.
So, looking at Daniel's prompt, our international yacht expedition is starting to look more like a very expensive vacation and less like a sovereign revolution. If we wanted to do something like a floating casino, we could do it, but we would be spending most of our time dealing with Panamanian maritime regulations and international gambling tax treaties. It is not exactly the pirate life I had in mind.
It would be a nightmare of paperwork. And for the questionable scientific experiments, I think the neighbors might notice the glowing green water trailing behind the Poppleberry flagship. The environmental laws on the high seas are actually getting much stronger. We are seeing more cooperation between nations to track pollution using satellite data. If you dump something in the water, they can trace the plume back to your coordinates with terrifying accuracy.
It feels like the era of the frontier is truly over. Even the parts of the map that are mostly blue are being filled in with lines and treaties. Is there anywhere left where the Poppleberry brothers can truly be free? Or are we destined to just follow the rules like everyone else?
Maybe the deep seabed? But as I mentioned, the International Seabed Authority has thoughts on that. The real takeaway here is that the high seas are a space for transit and resource extraction, not for settlement. The entire legal framework of the ocean is designed to keep things moving. It assumes you are going from point A to point B. When you try to stay in one place and build a life, the system breaks down because it was never meant to handle that. It is a highway, not a neighborhood.
So if someone is listening to this and they are dead set on living at sea, what is the most realistic path? Is it just buying a big boat and never staying in one place too long? The digital nomad, but with more salt spray.
That is the perpetual traveler or sea nomad lifestyle. You register your boat in a friendly jurisdiction, you follow the safety rules, and you move from port to port. You are never truly sovereign, but you are mobile. You can choose which set of local laws you want to deal with at any given time. It is a life of tactical compliance rather than absolute freedom. You use the system's own rules to give yourself the maximum amount of breathing room.
Tactical compliance. I like that. It sounds much more sophisticated than just running away. It is about navigating the gaps in the system rather than trying to build a new system from scratch. It is the stealth mode of sovereignty.
And for the seasteaders, the most successful projects right now are not the ones trying to be sovereign nations in the middle of the ocean. They are the ones partnering with host nations to build floating suburbs within their territorial waters. You get the benefit of the ocean lifestyle and the protection of a stable legal system. It is a compromise, but it is a compromise that actually stays afloat and gets insurance coverage.
It is like the difference between trying to start your own country in the woods and just living in a really nice van in a national park. One of them involves a lot more gunfire and legal battles, and the other one just involves a lot of solar panels and a good GPS. I think I prefer the van life, or the yacht life, as it were.
I think we should stick to the yacht, corn. We can still have the poker games and the science experiments. We just have to make sure the lab rats have the proper export licenses, and the poker chips are registered with the appropriate Maritime Gaming Commission. It is less romantic, but much more likely to end with us not in a jail cell in a country we cannot pronounce.
I will get started on the Panamanian registration paperwork. It turns out that escaping the state requires more forms than staying in it, but I suppose that is the price of the high seas. You are never really alone out there. You are just carrying the ghost of a nation with you in the form of a flag. It is a heavy thing to carry, but it keeps the other ghosts away.
That is a poetic way to put it, corn. The ocean is a mirror. If you go out there looking for a void, you just end up seeing the reflection of the world you tried to leave behind, usually in the form of a Coast Guard cutter appearing on the horizon. The law follows the person, and the person carries the law.
Well, I think we have thoroughly debunked the lawless ocean myth. It is a fascinating web of history and diplomacy. If you want to dive deeper into how we try to claim the unclaimable, you should definitely check out episode 68, where we talked about who owns the sky. It is a very similar story of people trying to draw lines on things that are constantly moving and refusing to stay still.
The sky is even more complicated because you cannot drop an anchor in a cloud, and the boundaries move at the speed of sound. But the maritime stuff is the foundation for all of it. It is where we first learned as a species that we had to share the parts of the world we could not occupy. It is the beginning of international cooperation, born out of the necessity of not crashing into each other in the dark.
I think that is a good place to wrap this one up. We might not be starting the Principality of Poppleberry on a decommissioned oil rig anytime soon, but at least we know why. We will just have to settle for being the kings of our own living room for now.
It is probably for the best. I get seasick anyway, and the internet connection on a sea fort is notoriously spotty.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping us on course, and a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, a quick review on your favorite podcast app really helps us grow the show and reach more people who are curious about the weird corners of our world.
You could also find our full archive and all the ways to subscribe over at myweirdprompts.com. We have over 1,000 episodes of this kind of nonsense waiting for you.
Until next time, keep your flags high and your paperwork in order.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts keep weird.